Boardroom Bound, episode 151, Marketing Yourself to Land Your First Board Seat with Vince Brooks.
Every business culture is different because of the way it's led. These things are what can be brought in immediately and naturally by people who are hired as veterans of military service. I think it's a very valuable perspective that they bring. The utility here is just having another point of view on the same problem and bringing another set of instincts to bear, which may fill in a gap in the understanding of the rest of the board members on certain matters and certain considerations.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we're speaking with General Vincent Brooks. This is a special Veterans Day episode, and I'm incredibly excited to have Vince on the show. He has had a phenomenal career going from West Point cadet, and 40 years later, when he retired in his career, he was a four-star general, becoming only the 8th African-American four-star Army general. And in addition to that successful career, he's now pivoted and is a portfolio of board roles. He's got 3 public company boards and 2 nonprofit boards. Today, we're going to hear about his individual journey. That's going to include lots of stories and nuggets and explaining why military members are such a valuable component that we need to have in a boardroom. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show. Vince Brooks, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Alexander, thanks for having me on. I'm delighted to be with you today.
And I want to be very clear for our audience, that was the fun shorthand, but this is General Vincent Brooks, retired 4-star general, and it is a pleasure to have you on, sir, as we think about Veterans Day. And this is just an excuse for me to be able to talk about not only best practices in a boardroom, but share the stories of people that have transitioned from the battlefield to the boardroom, bringing their amazing leadership and experience. And I don't think most of us realize when you're running the military, you're basically running a big company. It's a very large company with a very big budget, and we're going to talk about some of that today. But before we get to that, I think we need to understand your career and that amazing, growth from being a cadet to a 4-star general. So maybe you can unpack a bit of that for us, and then we'll get to some of the boardroom stuff.
Well, sure, Alexander. I mean, it's a long journey that one takes as a career military person, whether it's enlisted or officer. And mine began at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. I actually was following my brother into West Point. He was 1 year ahead of me. When he first came home after 6 months at West Point, he was transformed in a way that really inspired me to go in that direction. Initially, as a recruited athlete, I was a basketball player for the legendary Coach K when he was coaching basketball at West Point.
Right.
And went through all 4 years up there. It's a very competitive environment where every student is gifted with things like having been team captains, being National Honor Society, National Merit Scholars, being student body leaders. Everyone is in that category. So it's a very competitive place. And I found myself wanting to concentrate more on academics and military aspects of cadet life, beginning with my second year, my sophomore year, then in the first year where I actually added athletics to that. And so I stopped playing basketball, even though I was on the varsity team. And ultimately, that proved to be very beneficial as I immediately came out on the dean's list on the very next semester, and ultimately was able to be selected to serve in the most senior leadership position that a cadet can hold at West Point. That's the position of the cadet first captain or brigade commander. Position has been held by some very famous names through history, and I was honored to be one of those, and was the first African American to do so.
That is incredibly impressive. I was just going to say, alone playing for Coach K. Now, he left at some point and went to some other scrub school where he stayed for a little while. So that is a story in of itself. But being first captain, I believe there was the first African American female first cadet captain as well, right?
Just a few years ago, but that my class was the first class that had women.
Mm.
And by our senior year, when I was leading all 4,000 cadets, it was the first year that there were women in every class: freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior.
Wow.
And that was quite an honor to be part of that class. It was a historic class in many respects, and I did my part to add to that history.
And your illustrious career began that point, and then you went into the military. And I don't know if you expected to be a lifer and do the 40 years at that point, but certainly something happened, it growed, and you stayed, and you decided to be around for a while. Tell us a bit about that story.
Well, Alexander, I came from a military family. I know you have a military history too, and thanks for that. But my father was a career military officer that served for 29 and a half years. And as I mentioned, my brother was 1 year ahead of me at West Point. So it certainly was in the blood. It was in the family. That's the family business of sorts. But like anyone, I had to evaluate for myself if that was something I really wanted to do. Frankly, I was not interested in a military career while I was in high school or the years before that. I was interested in medicine. But having turned toward the military academy at West Point and being steeped in leadership in our nation's premier leadership institution, I found leading to be a very attractive future for me. And that's what really characterizes my career that followed for the next nearly 4 decades. It was positions of leadership and responsibility, starting with my first assignment as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where I was responsible initially for about 25 soldiers. And then over time, as I continued to grow in my career, that number got larger and larger and larger. The complexity got larger. The amount of money we were responsible for stewarding properly, and the stakes associated with the nature of the work we were doing became greater and greater, ultimately culminating as a 4-star general. And I would add another historic fact is being only the 8th African American to achieve 4 stars in the U.S. Army in its very long history. But that role had 620,000 troops, and that's quite a long way from the 20 or so that I had initially to ending with over 600,000 in a very complex environment. The situation in Korea that many know about in 2016, 17, and 18 was the time that I was in command there. And it was a very interesting experience that really brought together everything else that came before it with regard to leadership, risk management, development of cultures, global approaches to problem solving, culture. All these things were fundamentally brought together, and it was really a fascinating journey along the way.
And I would just like to put a little context around it, because I don't think we think of the military as a business, but my prior role at JP Morgan, that was a large company. It had 250,000 people. You were talking about leading 650,000. So you're talking about 2x that in some ways. Large organization, you're talking billions of dollars. You're talking about someone who had to be in front of Congress and testify. You're probably thinking about diplomats, ambassadors, chiefs of defense, chiefs of military services of different branches all around the world, different people you're interacting with. That's some of the most important people around the world. And I think that's what a lot of us need to recognize, is the people that are coming out of the military, that sort of leadership level, that experience is unbelievably valuable to corporations. When you think about any large multinational that has locations in different places, has customers in different places, is thinking about how they deal with some of the threats of today, whether it's cyber or technology or sophistication around supply chain. So all of that stuff that you were probably steeped in many ways. I don't know if you were thinking about board service as a likely landing spot as you were leaving the military, but at some point it seemed so natural for us to be looking at that and saying that makes sense. But Vince, how did that change happen when you left the military after 40 plus years, knowing that and exceeding in that role, thinking, what's the next challenge for me? And how did it end up in the boardroom?
The nature of military service, particularly at the senior levels, is one of uncertainty with regard to not only the portfolio of work and responsibility, but also with regard to the date of departure. You don't know when your time will come. And it's really at the behest of the president that very senior officers like 4-star generals and 4-star admirals get to serve. I had actually applied for retirement in 2016. I would retired in the summer of 2016, and had the retirement packet in and ready for final decision and approval. And we bought a house in Austin, Texas. And then I got instructions from the Secretary of Defense and the President that they needed me to go in a different direction. So I proceeded on to Korea in 2016 when I thought I was retiring. So I guess the point here is that senior leadership is about servant leadership, and it's about constantly being ready to continue to give and even play in overtime, to use a sports metaphor on that, as I felt that I was doing. But once the time comes, it tends to arrive more quickly than senior military leaders have had a chance to think about it. They're so devoted to their duty and serve so selflessly for so long that they're really not thinking about themselves. And everything from physical preparation of claiming for disability if necessary, to deciding where to live, and also, of course, doing what with one's life if given more life following military service. And that was a decision I had to go through, like everyone else did. And I thought about a portfolio of activity. I didn't think I wanted to go work for a single employer. And candidly, I didn't want to run something. I'd been running things for years. I wanted to be part of something and to make an impact, but I wanted it to be something of value and something of meaning. And candidly, I wanted it to be beyond the defense sector. I wasn't immediately interested in going into work in the defense sector writ large, even though that was certainly in my wheelhouse. But the challenge to myself was, can I do more than that? Can I learn more? Can I impact more? And can I bring all of me, not my military experience and portfolio per se, but kind of bring all of me into a new environment that's untested, uncharted for me. And that's really what guided me to making myself available for boards. I did let people know that I was interested in board service, and the very first one to get me was a person that I know for many years and have admired. He has his own foundation. That's Gary Sinise, the actor. And Gary is the first one that reached out to me. So it's one thing about trying to catch these retired generals, you need to do it quickly because they may have a number of knocks at the door, and given a history of not saying no, they're likely to be committed very, very quickly. But Gary was the first one, even before my retirement was effective, and asked me if I would come and help him with his foundation, which he was trying to grow to have a bigger impact for veterans, first responders, other defenders, and their families, and anyone else in need that the foundation can assist. So I said yes to that first and began duties on that board in the beginning of 2019. And it stayed really like that for about a year. And then suddenly the floodwaters began to flow in 2020, even at the beginning of COVID. And my board experience expanded considerably during 2020.
And there's so many places we can go here, Vince. I want to go back just for a minute before we started the Gary part. I was thinking about what you had done individually for the 40 plus years in the military, but also the sacrifice that your family made. You talked about your wife buying a house in Austin, Texas, and I wonder whether this factored into your thought process. And I think this would be interesting for audiences. They think about board roles and potentially a portfolio someday. And obviously this has changed during COVID because some of us were just at home on our board meetings on Zoom. But the idea that you wouldn't have to be going to a job every single day, much of it you can do from afar as your board roles. You're on calls, you're on Zooms, you're certainly showing up on whatever basis quarterly, potentially giving you more quality of life with your wife and your extended family that you may not have been able to handle during the military. Was that part of the discussion and decision process for you?
Oh, Alexander, absolutely. It's one of the most important considerations. Spending literally years apart for my wife throughout a long career like that. We wanted some time together. And we've been able to get that. And I think balancing the board duties has made that possible. And there are more things I'm doing in beyond boards where I'm still trying to find ways to give back. But those are episodic. And, of course, board duty is also episodic but cyclical. And there's predictability that comes with that. And that's valuable to someone who's spent too many years apart.
Well, thank you to her for her service. I'll put it that way. So,
Absolutely.
Vince, you were talking about then the doors started knocking and the floodgates opened. So, we most of us who know Gary Sinise, he was someone who's in the military, obviously great respect for it. You can see that coming through in many of the roles that he plays, right? An appreciation for that. And then there's a translation because you have a portfolio today, right? You've got a couple of nonprofit boards and I think 3 public company boards. Tell us about that first public company board, how that came about, and then perhaps your learning curve and onboarding. And clearly, COVID impacted that. It probably wasn't the norm that either you or the company expected. So walk us through that, if you would.
Certainly. In 2019, I had some leads for boards and was interviewed by several different boards. I'd also had some discussions with one of the major placement firms for senior executives and board directors. So that there was awareness that I was out there, but they weren't matches. And so the first 3 boards that I interviewed with, I was not chosen for. And that's not easy for somebody that's grown up in a competitive environment and is accustomed to being chosen, being the kid that gets picked to go on the team, not the one who's standing on the sidelines looking at the team. So emotionally, there was a bit of a journey that had to be undertaken. But with mentors and friends who shared with me that it's okay. First, make sure you have a good match for you. And then certainly, if there's not a good match for the board, it's okay. There'll be new opportunities, and be looking for those when they come. And so the first year, 2019, was more about finding my way into a board. And then in 2020, a search firm reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in joining a company that focused exclusively on oil and gas exploration in the Permian Basin of the United States. So it's a U.S.-only company. And my thinking was, well, that kind of meets my portfolio desire of being outside of the defense sector. It certainly would be way out of it. And I wanted to see. I'd already had conversations with some other boards and some other search firms and didn't have a match, but I learned how to ask certain questions. I learned how to begin to assess the board culture through my questions and also through interactions with some of the leaders that would be exposed to me. And we ultimately found our way onto the Diamondback Energy Board. And I was honored to join them. It's a great company. But, of course, as soon as I joined, we had the triple whammy that happened in the beginning of 2020. So first, warming of the climate impacted the consumption of fossil fuels in 2019. Then we had the pandemic ensue, and then we had an artificially induced global oil crisis that came from a competition between Saudi Arabia and Russia. All of these things happened in the span of 2.5 months, and it happened to be coinciding with my onboarding time. And so the entry was one of high risk in a highly volatile industry and market sector right away, and I had no choice but to learn quickly. And it's been a great learning experience, honestly, to try to figure out the language of business, the language of the oil and gas industry, and how businesses deal with volatility and risk. I certainly had practice with dealing with volatility and risk, but what does it look like from a business side? So it was an eye-opening experience for me. Of course, physically, I had only met the chairman and the CEO of Diamondback in the interview process. Everything else was done virtually because by the time we were really into this, we weren't physically meeting.
Right.
And I went through multiple meetings in the first year and a half without physically meeting anyone else. And of course, in the meantime, was approached by another search firm and invited to join the board of Jacobs, a completely different sector, providing critical solutions and solving complex problems, but also built through its history on the engineering construction industry. And in the midst of a pretty significant transition from that, and that too, I met only the chairman/CEO, since we have that particular role is conjoined in that company, and had to learn yet another language, the language of that particular industry, as well as continuing to learn the language of business. Finally, I was approached directly through another personal relationship. Friend of a friend caused my name to go into the boardroom for Verisk Analytics. And Verisk chose not to use a search firm, but use rather their nominating and governance committee to be the primary search firm entity. And I was approached by them and asked, and ultimately said yes, and was honored to join that too. So all three of these occurred in 2020, and it wasn't until mid-2021 that I physically met anyone on the board of any of the three.
Well, your dance card filled up very quickly, and you had a very strange onboarding experience in a very incredible period of time. And I'd love if we could unpack this for our audience today, Vince, because I think there are some people that can sort of look at what a board seat looks and feels like, and it can feel a bit glamorous, right? The compensation isn't bad. You're dealing with exciting stuff, but it's hard, especially if you're outside your traditional industry and your knowledge base. And some of these were clearly for you, and that's a fun thing, right? You're going to grow and develop and learn. That is a big part of it. Give us a sense of what that actually looked and felt like. Where you probably had like 3 different sorts of books on your nightstand you're trying to read, like an autobiography of someone in the industry you're learning about. You're trying to figure out the right terminology, like you said. There is a massive learning curve to get up to speed to feel like you can add a lot of value outside of the additional traditional expertise you brought into the room. Tell us what that actually felt like for you.
I certainly will, and it was an interesting climb in each case. First, learning the language of business. I took some NACD courses, the National Association of Corporate Directors, beginning with their unique course called Battlefield to Boardroom. And that helped me prepare initially for what I could expect if chosen for a board. It preceded all of the board joinings. It was during the time that Gary Sinise and I were finalizing, but it certainly preceded actually joining any one of the boards. It was very helpful. I further chose to go through the NACD Director Certification Program. Not a requirement, and it's not something that someone said, do you have this? If not, then you can't join the board. It was never a hindrance, but for me, it was an immersion that allowed me to deeply focus on what is important for a board director to learn, to do. What are my responsibilities? How do my fiduciary responsibilities get fulfilled? How can I tell if we're in good shape or bad shape? What sort of questions should I ask? And from that, it became clear that my instincts would be important to me, just as they were in military service, and that there were several categories where my instincts would be ready to be applied right away. I talked about a few of those earlier: risk, how we develop the human capital of the organization, the entire approach to governance, having a global view, understanding cyber threats, engaging in government relations, what crisis communications should look like, and having been through many of those myself and some of the roles that I fulfilled in the military, there were things that were evident in a short period of time that I could bring to bear. And at the same time, it was also quite evident that I didn't know very much about any one of those companies and how they really make their money and how they characterize the nature of their risk and their opportunities. And that was about studying and listening and participating in all committee meetings. So I guess my pace was higher than I'll presume normal, where if you are joining a board, you participate in the board meetings, you might be assigned to one committee, and you participate in those committee meetings. Not for me. I chose to participate in every committee of every board at every session. And so that meant a very, very heavy pace of activity so that I would get more deeply immersed in the culture of the organization as well as the business of the organization and the problems, challenges that are faced by the organization. And that was a great learning experience for me. It's still ongoing. Obviously, I've only been doing this for about a year and a half, and it continues to this day. Very, very beneficial, but a heavy climb nevertheless.
Yeah, Vince, I've never heard anybody trying to take on all the committees at once, and I would love to get your thoughts on this for our audience. So, for example, if someone said to me, I could choose whatever committee I would like to join, they've given me that option, which I choose, I would say take audit. And that might be one of the hardest for many people, but I think you'll learn the business really well, and the rest of the committees will make a lot more sense around it. Maybe 2. Now, I guess it depends if someone is fully retired and they're just doing board stuff versus also having a full-time executive job. But I've never heard someone take on that much of a challenge. Perhaps I shouldn't be surprised based on the incredible success and meteoric rise you've had in your career. But I would love if you could reflect on this for, let's call it like the average person joining their first board, whether they should take on such a challenge, or maybe it was possible because of COVID and everything was just on Zoom. Could you unpack a little bit for us?
it certainly was possible because of Zoom. You're in and you're out. They would tend to be concentrated. Most of the boards have the committee meetings in a concentrated period of time, but not scheduled on top of one another. None of the boards have their committee meetings scheduled concurrently. They're always sequential. And so it was certainly possible to participate in each one of them, to listen, and of course to actively participate where appropriate. And I learned that was the norm for me on entry. Now that we're physically meeting again, it's still possible to do that because you're going to be, in my case, away from home. None of these boards have headquarters in Austin, Texas, where I live. One is in Midland, Texas. One is in Dallas, Texas. One is in Jersey City. And the two nonprofit boards are in Washington, D.C. and Woodland Hills, California. So none of them are home games. And as a result, if you're going to be there, you might as well be there also for the committee meetings. So my encouragement would be for a new board director, newly assigned to a given company's board, to take in as much as they can. I agree with you on audit being the one that is generally looking at most of the scope of what the organization is undertaking. But I'm finding now, in the present time, that being on an ESG committee or whatever name is used for your social and corporate responsibilities, that too is a very important committee to be on nowadays because that tends to be where certain risks are discussed. That's where environmental impacts are discussed. That's where the considerations of legislation tends to be discussed, in addition to the audit committee, and in a very focused way. That's where diversity, equity, inclusion are discussed, and human capital development tend to rise there as well. So I'm finding that each one of them brings something different, and it's useful to me when I then go into the boardroom that I have a much deeper appreciation for what it is that the company is thinking and doing, and how the board actually works.
Well, Vince, let me actually just pick up on the DEI idea that you just mentioned. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm a big fan of using this podcast to promote diversity in a boardroom. I don't think you can innovate unless you have different thoughts in the background. And if we look at what has happened over the last 20 years in America, I think it really started with it shouldn't just be all male, right? So if we think the pale, male, and stale, let's deal with the male. And it's very visible in the annual photo for a public board. What does it look like? And you can also say, is it all white, or are you seeing Africans Americans and Latinos and others in there? Some that are a bit harder to see, maybe with someone of a veteran status, right? You can think of certain companies like USAA, for example, just obvious that they're going to have a 4-star from every branch of the military. That's their background. And we've already talked on this show, the experience that, say, senior members of the military like yourself leaving can bring to boards, maybe not as obvious as part of the DEI, but I would say it's an essential component, especially if that is some of the people that you believe are your customer base. Can you give us your thoughts on veterans and what they bring to boards and how that can be better represented by companies?
I do think that veterans should be considered as among the diverse pools from which talent is chosen for boards. And it reflects bringing a perspective of those things that I talked about. Fundamentally being immersed in a global view of things. And obviously it varies depending on what level of the service one was actually serving in. If you're a very senior leader, then you will have had years and years and years of dealing with the kinds of things that whatever company you're associated with is also dealing with. If you're more junior, you may have certain things that are deep as well, but they may not be as broad. For example, a really deep understanding of how to develop human capital. Our mid-career non-commissioned officers and senior non-commissioned officers, for example, are absolute pros at that, and it's one of the things that sets apart the U.S. military. But the senior officers tend to be the ones who are sought after for boards more frequently because of their broader view and their deeper experiences of multiple decades. What the military members bring is a different view of the same problem. And I completely agree with your point, Alexander, a couple of minutes ago, that you really can't innovate if you don't have diversity of thought in the room. And at least the military perspective brings one in differently. Candidly, there are so few that one of the first challenges that any military member entering a boardroom must overcome is the perceptions of the military. Principally, you're used to just being in charge and barking orders. We don't work like that around here.
Is that how it actually works in the
kind of thing
military?
comes up more frequently than one might imagine. And it's really based on a presumption that can only be overcome by firsthand experience that, we don't work like that in the military either. When it's time to give orders, you do. But more often than not, we're very collaborative about our approaches. We are inclusive and innovative about that, about how we solve problems. And every organization is different because of the way it's led, just like in business. Every business culture is different because of the way it's led. And these things are what can be brought in immediately and naturally by people who are hired as veterans of military service. I think it's very valuable. And it doesn't have to be someone who's even a full career. Let's say someone who has military experience, then goes into business on their own and has grown up in the business world. They still bring both perspectives into a boardroom should they be chosen to be a director at some later point in time in their career. And I work with several who are like that also. And it's a very, very valuable perspective that they bring. So this, I think, is the utility here is just having another point of view on the same problems and bringing another set of instincts to bear, which may fill in a gap in the understanding of the rest of the board members on certain matters and certain considerations, and as well as the corporate leadership.
I couldn't agree more. I think you need those difference of thought around the room. You expressed that very well, Vince. And as we begin to think about how to tie this together with a ribbon, you've been through quite the learning process in a very intense time during COVID. And the world has changed a lot. We've seen that. We may not fully grasp all of it yet. We've got some ideas. The boardroom has certainly changed forever, right? We'll never go back to the way it was in some ways. I would love if you'd sort of look into your crystal ball and you look forward to, you've finished your military successful career and you've got this portfolio of board roles, you're in your board career now. What do you think the future of work, or at least the future of the boardroom, is going to look like? And how do you see yourself playing and changing and continuing to grow in that space?
I think first that the boardroom is going to look different demographically. We're seeing that already with some of the ESG considerations, and indeed some of the major investors, of course, are demanding this from companies that they want to see diversity in the boardroom, and there will be accountability for doing so or failing to do so as well. So I think first it will look different than it did 10 years ago. Men, women, people of color, white males still will be present. That won't disappear, but it'll be a broader mix than it has been in the past. And I think with that, then, the nature of what it is that the board considers to be its fiduciary responsibility will move some. The things that the board will be concerned about or considering as it analyzes both risks and opportunities, that I believe will be in harmony, in the best cases, with society's expectations and demands as well. And it's already showing that can be lucrative from a business perspective. It actually can make things go even better and become more profitable, to reduce some of the frictions that might be out there with activists. It can eliminate some of the issues that might turn into litigation. So there might be a smoothing of the nature of the work being done by the corporate leadership and by the board. I believe that the corporate sector will have a greater opportunity to make more significant impacts to societies. And given that many of these companies that I'm part of have a global reach, it's not just the U.S. society that we have to be thinking about. There are impacts to each society where the footprint of the corporation actually has its work and its responsibility and its opportunities. So this whole idea of having a broader impact, I believe, will be part of the future. And the last point I'd make is how boards and corporate leadership will come to grips with the new normal of work. COVID has fundamentally changed how people think about their work-life balance, what's important to them, how they want to spend their time, even as they try to seek income that helps them take care of their families or to do the discretionary things they would like to be able to do, planning for their future being among those. How that is done is, I believe, fundamentally changed. And to the extent that boards can think forward, not from their own experiences. Boards tend to be people who are late in their careers or even in secondary careers like me. We tend to be older, but we must think about the employees who are younger and who are beginning, and in a world that is expecting something different in terms of what work looks like. looking forward into the crystal ball in each boardroom will be very, very important. How do you balance work and life? Is it 3 days on, 2 days off? When do you decide that you want to have someone physically present so that you can build organizational culture and cohesion? How many times should the board physically meet? As I mentioned, we went through all of 2020 and parts of 2021 with nothing but virtual experiences for me. And we got work done. Now, there's some things we didn't get, to be sure. The melding that happens within the board, among the board members and directors with leadership, that was not happening the same way. And so there's a trade-off here, and I believe that the future of boards and the future of the corporate sector will be balancing these types of considerations in new and different ways. And the ones who get to it quickly and most effectively will continue to be the ones who are most successful business-wise, I believe. The ones who hang on to the way it was are likely to get left behind as the entirety of global and personal expectations begin to change faster than the board's decisions might. But I hope to be part of boards who are forward-looking, and I am. At the present time, I certainly feel that each of the companies I'm a part of are very forward-looking and are gripping these types of considerations in the present so that they can shape the future. And it's an honor to be a part of each one of them.
Well, Vince, it was an honor to have you on the show today, and thank you for your 40-plus years of service to our country and for sharing your story today. And I think all of us listening, whether we've served in the military or not, can understand that process of I have to share what my candidacy is. I have to put myself out there. I have to make the connections and to make that work. And especially as we think about Veterans Day, when we want this episode to honor that, we are privileged to have had you on the show. I know you talked before about being only the 8th African-American to be the 4-star Army general. And I certainly think about Colin Powell and his passing recently. What a great leadership example he was as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I want to appreciate you for being so honest and sharing your insights and helping all of us and our audience today to be more boardroom bound.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Vince Brooks. It was fantastic to hear about his career and a demonstrated history of success and a change maker several times. And wonderful to hear about someone taking that battlefield experience and bringing it to the boardroom, where he now has a portfolio of board roles with 2 nonprofits and 3 public company boards. Great to hear about the lessons on this Veterans Day celebratory episode that our military members bring to the boardroom and how we need those experiences and stories. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.